Many discussions of geopolitics, world affairs today are based on what are now very dated accounts of world history over the last 500 years, very dated accounts of the rise of the West, the rise and fall of global empires over the last 500 years that are not really up to date with the best quality world history now, nor do they provide a balanced account of developments all across the world. And as today we are seeing events in China and India and Russia, all around the world, in the Americas and in Africa, reshaping the world, it is really important to bring a different kind of perspective to the assumed stories we have about world history that inform our analysis of what is happening today. So in this series of videos that I'm bringing to you on the Burning Archive, I'm digging into the detail of this account of the rise and fall of global empires from 1400 to 1600 by John Darwin in the book After Tamerlane. I've given you an overview of the narrative and of the main themes of the book, and in this video I'm looking at the period 1600 to 1750, what historians often describe as the early modern period, and show how this is not the story of the triumphant march of the West, of European domination of the world, or of the birth of America. It is a much more complicated story in which the other parts of the world had a big role to play. I'm Jeff Rich, and the Burning Archive helps you make sense of a puzzling world with history. You can go to jeffrich.substack.com and support my efforts to help you make more sense of this changing world we are all living in, so that we can live in tune with these changing times. You can join me there as both a free and paid subscriber to get my weekly writings on world history and world affairs. The common way of presenting this period of 1600 to 1750 is, as John Darwin says, after the discovery of the Americas, the early colonization of parts of Asia, the Americas and of Africa, it is the long march of European primacy. But John Darwin points out that is not how historians see it now, nor was it really how Europeans saw it at the time. It is, he says, in many ways an optical illusion, the deceptive product of hindsight. Indeed, Europeans, he writes, saw themselves as embattled against a triumphant Islam, even while they plundered the New World and invaded the Indian Ocean. Their own achievements in political, military and commercial organisation were matched or overshadowed by those of the Ottomans in Turkey, Middle East, North Africa and Eastern Europe, the Mughals in northern India, the Ming in China, or Tokugawa in Japan. State building and cultural innovation were striking features of Eurasian, not just European history in the early modern era. Indeed, he writes, rather than merely telling the story either as the triumphant rise of the West or as the dark domination of the rest of the world by European colonialism, John Darwin writes that indeed, by contrast with the drama of discovery and conquest, with whose consequences Europeans had barely come to terms by the early 17th century, the century or more that followed was a phase of much more gradual change in Europe's relations with the extra-European world. It was, he said, the period of early modern equilibrium, where Europe and all those other powers of the world, in what is today China, India, Central Asia, West Asia, Eastern Europe, and indeed Russia and Japan were much more equally balanced. And the question really became, how long would that balance last? And that really occurs in the Eurasian Revolution, which is the next period from 1750, which I'll cover in my next video. But John Darwin breaks his narrative about this period really into 5 sections. The first is the limits of ambition Europeans in the wider world. That really looks at how European societies had severe internal problems. It wasn't the glorious scientific revolution, the glorious Enlightenment. It was a period of internal instability and internal European conflict that to some degree limited the extent to which European powers could engage beyond the greater Europe of the Americas, and Russia could engage with the rest of the world. The second section is inland imperialism from Muscovy to Russia, which looks at the great expansion of Russia, which John Darwin firmly argues is part of that greater Europe and its great expansion all the way to the Pacific Ocean by 1639 in this era. And then the third section is about renovation in East Asia. In 1644, there was a changeover from the Ming to the Qing or Manchu dynasties in China, but there was a period of great prosperity and state building and successful institution building in this era for China. He then looks at the Islamic empires under strain, looking at the Ottomans, the Mughal, and the Safavids in Persia or Iran. And he explores how they were under strain and yet still had some significant achievements in this era, and presented real challenges and limitations on European powers. And then finally he comes back to revisit what really was Europe's role in Eurasia, again against the broad theme that the diversity of cultures, the push and pull of trade and military power and technological development and cultural identities has always made it impossible for a single ruler or a single set of rules to dominate Eurasia, let alone to dominate the world. So let's look at each of those sections in turn. The first section is the limits of ambition Europeans in the wider world. Now, of course, this period between 1600 and 1750 includes some major events, some of which you've probably heard of. In 1600, there's the time of troubles in Russia. In 1648, there's the Treaty of Westphalia in Europe. In 1644, the Ming Dynasty. In the early 1600s, the Tokugawa dynasty establishes itself in Japan. It takes us all the way up into the 1750s when the 7 Years' War occurs in Europe, but also around the world, and is often seen as the first world global war. So it's a big range of events that we're going to cover. I'm not going to provide a detailed timeline or chronology in this video, but I'm going to try to pick out the key points and themes of each of these different areas of the world which were equally balanced with European power in this period. But let's begin with Europe. And as John Darwin says, this period shows limits of ambition for Europe. It is true that the Americas have been colonized, and this brings great wealth and new plants and animals and other resources to America and to Europe, and establishes, the silver trade between South America, Spain, the Philippines and China. It's of crucial significance, establishes in a way a whole new process in the global economy. John Darwin argues in this era, Europe is really more focused on consolidating its grip on the Atlantic world. The Atlantic world based on the trade of commodities and slaves. And although Europe has a presence in Asia and Africa and the Americas, it is what John Darwin describes as an archipelago of settlements, mines and trading depots connected by a skein of pathways. It is not a solid territorial empires across the whole world. Indeed, he illustrates this in part by looking at the Americas, and even up until 1820s. It's estimated that there were 4 times as many African people, because of the slave trade, than Europeans on the American continent. It was institutionalized, if you like, in the bizarre societies of the sugar colonies, of the sugar plantation colonies of the Caribbean. And it was very much a world, thinly established world of transatlantic trade in commodities, silver, gold, sugar, tobacco, and tragically, slaves. And within Europe itself, there was quite uneven development and a constant sense of crisis. Now, I guess many geopolitical accounts refer to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, but it tends to also neglect that this was the era of the Ancien regime in Europe, of the fabulous Baroque courts of Louis XIV and others, but a complex, luxurious, but highly ineffective, aristocratic world over largely peasant society. And although there were significant scientific and other industrial sort of achievements in this period, there was a lot of internal instability in Europe, the states of Europe. It was not really the world order established by the Treaty of Westphalia that is often presented in the standard international relations political science account. Indeed, John Darwin writes that the gradual emergence of a more orderly ancien regime over a large part of Europe did not imply a neat division into unified nation-states. Germany remained a vast patchwork quilt of over 300 states, mostly of trivial size. The Habsburg monarchy, combining territories in modern Belgium after 1713, northern Italy, Hungary after 1683, Central Europe and the northern Balkans, was hardly more than a loose-knit alliance of different kingdoms, precariously unified in the person of the emperor. Even in France, integrating the provinces acquired by marriage, diplomacy and conquest was an uphill struggle. As late as 1720, Paris had to crush a separatist conspiracy by Breton nobles enraged by economic hardship and the fiscal burden. And of course, the internal instability was reflected in events such as the Time of Troubles in Russia or the English Civil War in the mid-17th century. There was endemic instability in Europe, and with it a cockpit mentality of frequent and constant wars. There was the 30 Years' War that was ended by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, but many, many wars. Subsequently, it was not a universal peace that was established by that treaty all the way up to the 7 Years' War, the 7 Years' War in the 1750s. And John Darwin notes that technological and commercial expertise of the Occidentals was often counterbalanced by the fact that aggression and competition was turned in on themselves. Nevertheless, there was an emerging sense of European superiority, but at this stage in the 17th and early 18th century, that sense of superiority was most marked by the conquest of the Americas, and there was a more modest attitude towards Asia and Africa, and a weakening of the ambition to establish universal Christian culture, a sort of commitment, as expressed, for example, by Montesquieu in The Entrenched Diversity of Religions and Civilizations. The second section of John Darwin's chapter on this period, on the early modern equilibrium, looks at the inland imperialism from Muscovy to Russia. And Russia is often neglected in the story of world history, but its empire, its state, if you like, was crucial. And John Darwin treats it not so much as a strange alien civilization different to Europe, so much as, I guess, the eastern wing of a greater Europe, with the Americas as the western wing and Russia and its extraordinary expansion through the 17th century all the way to the Pacific coast as the eastern wing. Indeed, he writes, although so much world history is focused on the Euro-American, Western European-American expansion of the maritime economy, European expansion had two faces, towards the sea and towards the land. Between the 1620s and the 1740s, the most dynamic overland expansion by Europeans lay along the frontiers of Russia. And in telling this story, it is just truly astonishing expansion indeed. It's one that is often obscured in Western versions of this history that tend to focus on Protestant and Catholic Europe, not Orthodox Europe. But the scale of expansion in the 17th and 18th centuries was dramatic. He notes that the land surface of Russia increased from 2.1 million square miles in 1600 to some 5.9 million a century later. That's nearly by a multiple of 3. Yet even so, Russia still struggled to populate, I guess, this and to establish strong internal control over this vast territorial empire, which similarly exploited resources like Western Europe did in the Americas. But the story of inland imperialism from Muscovy to Russia also brings in one of the great figures of Russian history, of course, Peter the Great, who looked both to the south, I guess, towards, if you like, Ukraine and the Black Sea, and to the west. And here there is, of course, a fascinating connection with current events. In this book, John Darwin notes that it was really, to some degree, Peter the Great's defeat of Sweden, Poland, and his victory in Ukraine that was crucial to Russia's eastward imperialism. He writes, after the Treaty of Pereslavo in 1654, the Tsars had enjoyed a special relationship with the autonomous Hetmanate, the part of Ukraine that lay beyond the frontier of Polish control in this semi-colonial region. And it ultimately led, after many internal conflicts within Ukraine, which are quite complex to follow, and defeats of the Ottomans, it led to a crushing victory for Peter the Great at the Battle of Poltava in 1709 that marked the effective absorption of the eastern Ukraine into his imperial system. As a stage in Russia's advance towards Eurasian empire, the acquisition of the Ukraine, opening the road to the Black Sea, might be likened to the British conquest of Bengal after 1757. Of course, Ukraine's a lot closer to Russia than the Bengal is to India. So John Darwin does something that so many histories of the rise of the West fail to do, which is properly integrate Russia into the history of the world. And he says that Russia's expansion is really a model of European expansion to set beside that of the maritime West. His third section looks at the renovation in East Asia, and looking at particularly Japan and China. And I guess the common view in many accounts of the rise of the West type stories is that Japan and China turned inward in the 16th and 17th centuries, and in contrast to the dynamic, innovative, exploratory West, drifted into cultural stasis and economic stagnation behind the political barrier of xenophobic diplomacy. They stopped China stopped its great navigations across the Indo-Pacific, and Japan similarly closed itself off to some aspects of European trade. But Darwin questions this narrative. There were two dynasties established in this period that lasted for 250 years. The Tokugawa dynasty, the shogunate in Japan, which has been, featured in the wonderful new television series Shogun that you can all watch. It establishes a remarkable period of peace and prosperity in Japan, and the Manchu or Qing dynasty in China after 1644. In both cases, these states experienced rapid population growth, extensive agricultural colonization, territorial expansion, widening of internal commerce, and a rising demand for books of genuine, something of a cultural, renaissance, if you like. These two strengthening dynasties made East Asia more resilient when it came to later European encounters in the late part of the 18th century. In China, the Qing and Manchu dynasty replaced the Ming dynasty in 1644, and over the next period from 1644 to really the end of the 18th century, there was three remarkably long serving emperors that provided a stability and a kind of success for this Qing dynasty. Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong Kangxi served from 1661 to 1723, so that's about 60 years, 62 years. And Qianlong served from 1735 to 1796, so that is 61 years to 60-year imperial reigns. And they were both very impressive emperors. They consolidated Chinese rule in Inner Asia, including negotiations with Russia, and this was an exceptionally dynamic period in Chinese history where many of the institutions of the Chinese state were sort of developed. There was significant population increase and some level of cultural renewal and greater cultural unity within China. And John Darwin notes that this occurred at a very significant time. The timing of Manchu consolidation, Manchu is another term for the Qing dynasty, between 1680 and 1750 was highly significant. On the eve of the close encounter with the West, China's distinctive political trajectory, still dominated by its symbiotic relationship with Inner Asia, propelled it not towards an all-powerful Oriental despotism, imagined by Europeans, even as late as, I guess, Joe Biden, which might have permitted drastic change in the face of external challenge, but instead still further towards a limited Raj in which central government abandoned almost all initiative to local and usually conservative forces. When China's 18th century economic miracle turned sour, the scope for political change was correspondingly narrow. So there's a very interesting development there, but not, I guess, the usual cliche of the sleeping giant, which I think was the phrase that Napoleon used about China. Then in Japan, of course, there was the Japanese shogunate established by Tokugawa, as shown in the TV series Shogun. Again, this provided a sense of political stability, state building, consolidation, and cultural renewal in this country, and also a period of internal peace in which there was significant population growth from 12 to 31 million between 1600 and 1721. There was a Japanese seclusion, but John Darwin describes it not as a closed door, but a narrow gateway and observation post on the rest of the world. It was a period of economic dynamism and cultural dynamism in Japan, and one in which it is perhaps best understood as much as playing its distinctive role within the East Asian world order as being the sleeping, the hermit empire of Western imperial cliche. The fourth section looks at Islamic empires under strain. Again, these empires of the Ottomans, based around Turkey, Middle East, Eastern Europe, North Africa, the Safavid, based around Iran, Iraq, Central Asia, and the Mughal empires in northern India, are often presented as going through a period of introversion, conservatism, versus the dynamic innovation, scientific enlightenment, European Renaissance. But again, John Darwin presents these more complex story of the role of these empires, which formed a belt across the centre of Eurasia, taking all the way, I guess, to the Ming dynasty in China. China, East Asia. There was some loss of dynamism and some weakening of internal solidarity, but it was a more complex story. The Ottomans lost territory between 1683 and 1739, but also then regained some in later periods. In 1699, they ceded Hungary and Transylvania. In 1718, Serbia and parts of Romania to Austria. Again, these parts of Europe were then controlled by the Ottomans. And in 1740, they become more involved in the European state system, as well as being more in conflict with Russia, particularly around the Black Sea area. There is an argument that the Ottomans were sort of self-harmed, if you like, through willed ignorance. But John Darwin notes that most of Europe was backward and intolerant at this time too. You get a distorted perception if you compare one sliver of European society to one aspect of Ottoman society. What he says of the Ottomans is, it was clear by 1740 that the Ottoman Empire could not match the most prosperous parts of Europe in artisan production or agrarian improvement. It also lacked the means to transform itself into a nation-state or a national economy along the classic lines of European mercantilism. Nevertheless, by accident or design, Ottoman governments had devised a surprisingly successful formula for imperial survival in the more difficult conditions that they faced from the 17th century. They had learned to play the European diplomatic game, exploiting French antipathy towards the Habsburgs to help regain Belgrade. They encouraged foreign trade while segregating foreign merchants and reducing the West's gravitational pull upon Muslim society. With their sovereignty unimpaired, with their unchallenged status as guardians of the holy places in Mecca, Medina and Jerusalem, and as the overlord of Cairo, the cultural and intellectual capital of Islam, the Ottomans had been able to keep the delicate balance between the different elements of their extraordinary system. A multi-ethnic empire perched on the flank of Europe and the political embodiment of Orthodox Islam in its Near Eastern heartlands. Then the second big Islamic empire is the Mughals. And again, they were under strain, but they were also extraordinarily prosperous in this time. Think the Taj Mahal. In Delhi in 1648, it is as large as Paris. We really need to flip some of our sense of the relative weights of different places in world history. And indeed, John Darwin says Mughal power was a very key factor in early modern history. It was a key part of the growing international trade system. There was trade into Central Asia, and the Indian coast was one of the great attractors of the Europeans to Asia. The pepper and the gems and many other items from the cloth from India. But there were also difficulties establishing a clear state and rivalries with some of the minor Hindu states within India, the growing power of the Marathas, and in 1739, the invasion of Delhi, the sacking of Delhi by the Persian ruler, warlord ruler Nadir Shah, which was in its own way a dramatic event in world history. Who took the peacock throne from Delhi, an extraordinary event, a very key event in the history of India. But John Darwin makes the point, which is really important, that there is a sort of a black legend of Indian history that was very much, spread by the British colonial rulers, that, the Indians could not rule themselves. And he says, in recent years, this simplistic black version of India's pre-colonial history has largely been rewritten. And again, this is why I'm doing these videos. There's a lot of rewriting of world history that is not making its way into the general discussion of world affairs. The late Mughal period no longer makes sense as the chaotic prologue to colonial rule. India's conquest was a more complex affair than the foredoomed collapse of an overstretched empire and the pacification of its warring fragments by European rulers with superior political skill. A realistic account of the half-century that ended at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the opening salvo of Britain's colonial conquest, would stress the part played by Indians in building new networks of trade and new regional states. It was this that helped to set off the crises that overwhelmed them unexpectedly in the 1750s. And we'll get more into the 1750s and the dramatic central role of India in world history in those decades in the next episode of this series. But again, John Darwin counters this theme that Europe was rising and the rest of the world was asleep, ready to be taken over by the culturally superior Europeans. He notes, in their own assumptions, that is, not mine, South Asia in the first half of the 18th century should not be seen as a region that was drifting from stagnation to anarchy. In the northern interior, the triangular conflict between Marathas, Mughals and the transmontane invaders was also a struggle between gentry groups who were striving to build a stable and sedentary order of towns, markets and settled agriculture, and warrior groups who were part of the old tradition of nomadic pastoralism on the upland plains connecting northern India and Central Asia. The last group he looks at are the Safavid rulers based around Iran, Iraq, Persia. I'll be briefer on them, but they similarly experience some decline, but with moments of resurgence. He notes in particular the astonishing role of Nadir Shah. He says, at the moment of dissolution, a new political force appeared to drive off the Ottomans, Russians in Gil's eyes. That was Nadir Shah. And he also notes how a new empire of Durranis was established, really based around Afghanistan, but extraordinarily wider area as well, that, thrived on the huge commercial route between India and Russia and Central Asia, and that it lasted until the British battles in the first half of the 19th century. So we have then a different sense of Europe's role in the world, a Europe that has established a loose network across the Atlantic world and is focused on the maritime west of Europe, is focused on consolidating that hold. A Europe that within itself is internally politically stable, if commercially and culturally dynamic, and prone to conflict within itself, wasting to some degree some of its technological and commercial, even perhaps cultural advantages by internal wars, notwithstanding the Treaty of Westphalia, and also the other east wing of the greater Europe, Russia, expanding dramatically all the way to the Pacific coast of Eurasia in this period. But against that, we have the understrain but resilient empires, Islamic empires of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal. We have the extraordinary, stable, successful, resilient states of the Tokugawa and the Qing in China and Japan, who form their own kind of East Asian world order, just as the Europeans believed they'd formed a world order with the Treaty of Westphalia. And so we have a much more evenly balanced distribution of power over the early modern multipolar world. Again, in his conclusion, Europe's place in Eurasia, he notes that historians have often been tempted to see the later part of early modern times as the grand prelude to the supremacy of Europe, and to imagine the imminent triumph of a global economy dominated by commercially advanced core states in northwest Europe. In fact, there are few grounds for taking so deterministic a view of a period whose most striking feature was the limited influence that the European states could muster across most of Eurasia. From a European perspective, the most significant change was to be found not in Europe's relations with the Indo-Islamic world or the civilizations of East Asia, but in the consolidation of a huge region of settlement, trade and slavery in the Euro-Atlantic, West Africa, Brazil, Peru, Mexico, the Caribbean, and the French and English colonies in eastern North America. It's a very different story to the standard rise of Western civilization story. And it's a different story to claims about modernity and the killer apps of the West and all that kind of thing. So he notes we should be cautious about assuming that the wealth and dynamism of Europe were sufficient to drive European power deeper into Eurasia, as we have seen, except in parts of the Near East, Europeans had made little headway in carving out new markets in Asia, and still less in asserting their physical domination, apart from in a few favoured locations. So I hope that story of a much more suspenseful story of world history, a much more multipolar, evenly balanced story of world history, gives you some insight to better understand world affairs today. Because after all, America, the Euro-Atlantic world, loosely established in this period of 1600 and 1750, would come to think of itself as dominating the world, and in many ways in some of these later periods does dominate the world, but always with resistance and never with the determined certainty that John Darwin criticises in his wonderful book After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires. I hope this video has helped you, has raised your curiosity about this book, John Darwin, After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires. Over at my Substack, jeffrich.substack, I'm doing a little deep dive into the post-1945 world as seen through John Darwin's book, After Tamerlane. And that directly links this story of the rise and fall of global empires to so many of the events we're seeing today, where that post-1945 world seems to be unravelling. And these long, deep trends of many different power sources around the world are coming again to the fore. Thanks for watching. Please do join me over at jeffrich.substack.com.